Now that we can calculate the distribution stats, we can build this chart. So a chart has one required argument, and that is a series list, all of the information that needs to populate this chart. And to create a series list, we first need to create a list of data. And in this case, we're going to model every individual piece of data with a simple model class, which will outline what properties every piece of data should have. So we'll follow these steps one by one, starting at the top by creating a simple model class. I'll go to Models, New Dart File, I'll name this Chart Model. I'll create a new class, Chart Model. So the first property will be an int, and we'll name that score. So that'll represent how many times a word has been correctly guessed at a given row. So we know in Wordle, the row where a word has been guessed in the most recent game will be a different color. So we'll set a bool to represent that, and we'll just name this current game. And I won't make that one final. So now we need to create our class constructor, class model, and these both need to be required. Okay, so now we've set up our chart model. Now in Utils, I'll create another Dart file, and I'm going to name this chart series. So in here, I'm going to create a method, getSeries, and the job of this method is to return a series list that will populate the chart. So firstly, I need to import the Flutter charts library. Okay, so the purpose of this method is to return a list of series that will populate our chart. So up here, I'll write list, and I need to write charts.series. So to access our series class, I need to write charts.first. Then in angle brackets, we need to take in two types of data. The first is our chart model that we just created, and for a bar chart, the second that we need to take in is a string. So this method returns a list of series, which is basically all of the information that's going to populate our chart. So firstly, we need to create the data. So I'll create a list of chart model. I'll name this data. Now we need to populate that by retrieving the stats we saved locally. So we'll use shared preferences, get instance, to get an instance of our shared preferences, return that in a variable, and we need to make this method asynchronous by using the async keyword. And then here I'll write prefs.getStringList, and we'll use that keyword to retrieve the stats. Again, let's save that in a variable. I'll name this scores, and we'll await that. Now before we access that variable, we need to check if it's not null. We may have not saved anything yet. If it's not null, then we want to populate our list of chart model. I'll use a for in loop. Then for each element that's looped over, we'll write data.add, and we want to add a chart model that takes in a score and also a current game. So we'll set this as false, and we'll update this shortly. So the current game will help us change the color of the row where the last word was guessed correctly at. Now here we need to pass in an int, but we have a string, so we need to pass this string. So use int.pass, and that's done. So we now need to update current game, so we need to know the current row. Let's go back to calculate chart stats, and here we set our string list. Let's also set an int. So if this is passed in as 2, 2 will be saved against the key of row. So up here we can also access that information by writing final row get int, pass in the key of row. Down here we'll just do the same. If row does not equal null, then data at the index of row dot current game, so we'll access the current game property and we'll set that to true at that index. Now again we need to adjust this because our list runs from 0 to 5, but row will be from 1 to 6, so I'll just write -1 here. So now that we've created our list of data, we can use that to create a series list which will populate our chart. So to do that, we'll be using the series class, and that has 4 required properties. The first is an ID, the second is data, so that's the list of data we just created. The third is a domain function, which is the input values for the chart, and lastly is the measure function, which is the output values. To set that up, I'll write return, and we need to return a list of series, so I'll use the square brackets here. And now we need to write charts.series. Now we need to take in the types, so again a chart model and a string. And now we need to pass in values to those 4 properties we just went over. So the first one, our ID, we'll just set that as stats, doesn't really matter. Next, we need to pass in data. So here we'll pass in the data variable we just created, our list of data. Now we need to create our domain. So this takes in a function, and here we have access to the values in our chart model and also an index. And the left hand side here will be the domain, and we can see that runs from 1 to 6. So we can use the index here to label our domain from 1 to 6. Now we could write return index and then .toString, but that will run from 0 to 5. So in this case, let's create a local variable, and we'll say index plus 1. Then we just need to return I and call toString because we need to return a string. And the last required property is a measure function. So again, this takes in a function. We have access to the data on our model and an index. In this case, I can just use the arrow syntax, and the output values will be the scores for each of our rows. So I can write model.score. So we're now returning a list of series that will populate our chart. Now we do have an error up here in the return type, and that again is because this method is asynchronous. So right click, let's return a future. Now we can actually move on to the final step, which is to create a bar chart widget. In the next video, we'll pass the series list into a bar chart and display it in the app.